Welcome back to Family Shadows, a place where stories of sacrifice, betrayal, and quiet justice unfold. Stories that remind us of the values that truly hold families together. If this is your first time here, I invite you to subscribe so you don't miss the stories that may echo your own or someone you know. Tonight's story is titled, "I Refuse to Give My Son the House, so my daughter-in-law tried to push me off the balcony." Now, let us begin. Richard Cole had always been an early riser. At 62, with hair graying at the temples and hands marked by decades of honest work as a bricklayer, he found mornings to be the only part of the day still untouched by disappointment. Before the sun cleared the rooftops, before his son or daughter-in-law stirred from their upstairs rooms, Richard would brew a pot of strong black coffee and step onto the balcony of the house he had built with his own hands. The house was not just lumber, plaster, and paint. It was his life's ledger. Every nail was hammered in during weekends, every wall painted after long shifts. He had carried bricks when his back was stronger, lifted beams when his arms were younger. He remembered his late wife, Alina, standing in the kitchen as he laid the final tiles on the floor. She had run her hands across them and whispered, "This home will keep us together." That was almost 30 years ago. Now, the home was less a gathering place and more a bargaining chip. His son, Daniel Cole, had asked to meet in the living room that morning. Daniel, 35, was tall, his hair slicked back the way corporate men in the city wore it. He had always carried an air of entitlement, something Richard blamed himself for. After Alina's death, Richard had tried to give Daniel everything: good schools, a car, help with his first apartment. He had hoped generosity might soften grief. Instead, it seemed to sharpen Daniel's hunger for more. "Dad," Daniel began, adjusting his tie though it was Saturday, "it's time we make this official. The house should be transferred to my name, legally." Richard stirred his coffee slowly. "Why now, son?" "You're not getting any younger," Daniel replied with a tone that was supposed to sound practical but landed cold. "And with Sophia and me planning, well, expansions for our future, it makes sense. Banks trust us more if we own property outright. This house is the logical choice." Sophia. Even when she wasn't in the room, Richard felt her presence like a shadow stretching across the walls. Sophia was beautiful, sharp, and calculating. She had the kind of smile that could light up a dinner party but also cut through a man's dignity in private. Richard had seen the way she looked at the house, not as a home but as a prize. Richard let the silence stretch. He wasn't a man who spoke in haste. He looked around the living room, the worn leather armchair where Alina used to read, the mantel with faded photographs of Daniel as a boy, Lucy's crayon drawings still taped beside them. To Daniel, these things were clutter. To Richard, they were proof of life, memory, and love. Finally, Richard spoke. "Daniel, this house isn't just a property. It's where your mother and I built our life. It's where Lucy feels safe when she visits. It's not something I can just sign over like a check." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Dad, no one is saying you have to move out right now, but it's paperwork, it's planning. You always taught me to plan." Richard nodded slowly. "Planning, yes, but planning isn't the same as giving away what anchors a family." Unbeknownst to Richard, at the top of the stairs, Sophia had been listening. Her lips pressed thin, her nails tapping against the railing. She didn't like delays. Delays cost opportunity. She whispered under her breath, words Richard could not hear, "Stubborn old man." When she descended the stairs moments later, her face wore the sweetness of a hostess. "Good morning, Richard. Coffee smells wonderful." She kissed Daniel lightly on the cheek and slid beside him, her presence both comforting to her husband and unnerving to her father-in-law. "Daniel told me about your conversation," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "I think it's wise to secure the house now. It ensures Lucy's future." Richard looked at her, then at Daniel. He could see the rehearsed lines, the practiced choreography. This wasn't a son's request, it was a couple's campaign. "I appreciate your concern," Richard said, keeping his voice calm, "but Lucy's future will be secured by values, not by titles on paper. And this house, it's not ready to change hands." Sophia's smile froze, then faded. Behind her eyes, something darker flickered. That night, after Daniel and Sophia retreated upstairs, Richard remained in the living room with the lights low. He held a photograph of Eleanor in his hands. She had been gone for 12 years, but in moments like this, her presence returned with aching clarity. "What would you have done, Ellie?" he whispered to the photo. He could almost hear her voice. "You don't protect a house by giving it away, Richard. You protect it by standing firm, even if it means standing alone." Richard sighed, setting the photo back on the mantel. Standing alone was not foreign to him, but standing against his own son, it pierced deeper than any wound life had dealt him. The next morning, Richard found Sophia on the balcony watering the plants. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her expression bright but eyes sharp. "You know," she said casually, "a house is wasted on memories. Memories don't pay bills. Memories don't grow value. You should think about the living, not the dead." Her words cut like glass. Richard tightened his grip on the railing. "Memories," he said softly, "are the only thing that make a house worth living in." Sophia tilted her head, smiling faintly, but there was steel in her gaze. "You'll see, Richard, everyone has a breaking point." By the end of that week, the house felt different. Shadows seemed longer, conversations shorter. Lucy, sweet and innocent, still ran to Richard after school, wrapping her little arms around his waist. "Grandpa," she chirped, "will you tell me one of your stories tonight?" "Yes, sweetheart," Richard whispered, forcing a smile. But even as he hugged her, his eyes caught Sophia watching from the doorway, her arms crossed, her smile thin. Richard realized something then. This was no longer just about papers and signatures. It was about control, about whether love and memory could withstand the siege of ambition. And for the first time, Richard wondered if the home he had built, the fortress of his family, was becoming a battlefield. Thank you for listening to Chapter 1 of tonight's story. If this touched something in you, if it reminded you of the weight of memories or the quiet battles fought inside families, don't forget to subscribe to Family Shadows. There are 7 more chapters in this story, and each carries its own storm, climax, and message. I hope you'll stay with me to the end. That evening, after dinner plates were stacked in the sink and the television hummed softly in the background, Daniel and Sophia retreated upstairs. Richard remained in his chair by the window, pretending to read a worn newspaper. But the truth was he was listening, because houses like this carried voices through vents and thin wooden floors. He could hear their murmurs, faint but insistent. Sophia's voice was sharp, a whisper coated with venom. "You should have pressed harder, Daniel. He's weak, he's old, he's clinging to bricks and memories." Daniel's reply was muffled, frustrated. "You don't understand my father. He doesn't bend. He digs in like those old trees in the yard. You can't just move him." Sophia laughed under her breath. "Trees fall, Daniel. All it takes is the right storm or the right push." The words sent a shiver through Richard's spine. He closed the paper and folded it neatly, though his hands trembled. Richard had once believed Daniel's hunger was a good thing. A son should strive, he thought. A son should reach for more than what his father had. But what he heard upstairs was not hunger, it was greed, sharpened and emboldened by Sophia's tongue. He thought of Alina again. She would have known how to speak to Daniel, how to soften his edges. But Alina was gone, and the house that once smelled of her cooking and laughter now smelled of plotting. Richard placed the paper on the table and rubbed his temples. He was not afraid of losing the house. He was afraid of losing his son completely. The next morning, Sophia cornered Daniel in the kitchen while Richard brewed coffee. "You can't keep stalling," she pressed, lowering her voice. "Opportunities are slipping. The bank won't wait forever, and neither will I." Daniel leaned against the counter, his face drawn. "He's my father. You think I can just wrestle the deed out of his hands?" Sophia's eyes gleamed. "Not wrestle, convince. Wear him down, push his buttons, make him feel guilty, remind him of everything he owes you." Richard stirred his coffee slowly, pretending not to hear, but every word pierced him. His son was no longer the boy who once begged him to build a treehouse, who had cried when he scraped his knee. This was a man with sharp edges, learning to sharpen them further under his wife's watch. Later that day, Sophia invited Richard to join her on the balcony. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves. "It's a beautiful house," she said, her tone syrupy. "You must be proud." Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It would be such a shame," she continued, "if all of this went to waste because of stubbornness. Think of Daniel. Think of Lucy. You want them to be secure, don't you?" Richard turned to face her, his jaw tight. "Lucy will be secure if she grows up with love and honesty, not schemes." Sophia's smile never faltered, but her eyes darkened. "You talk like love pays bills, like honesty builds futures. Wake up, Richard. This is the real world." For the briefest moment, her hand rested on the railing beside his. Her nails tapped against the iron bars, tap, 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 as though measuring their strength. Richard stepped back, his chest tightening. That night, Richard sat on the edge of his bed. He could not sleep. The whisper from upstairs replayed in his mind. "Trees fall, Daniel. All it takes is the right storm or the right push." He thought of Lucy, asleep in her room down the hall, clutching the teddy bear he had bought her years ago. He thought of how she trusted him, how her eyes lit up every time he promised, "Grandpa will always keep you safe." And then he thought of Sophia's tapping nails on the railing. Meanwhile, in their bedroom, Daniel stared at the ceiling. Sophia lay beside him, scrolling through her phone, already looking at listings for vacation homes and new cars. "She'll never forgive me," Daniel murmured. "Who?" Sophia asked without glancing up. "My father. If I push him too hard, he'll never forgive me." Sophia sighed and placed her phone on the nightstand. She turned toward him, her voice soft but laced with steel. "Daniel, forgiveness doesn't pay tuition. It doesn't buy the life we deserve. Sometimes you have to choose between loyalty and legacy. Which matters more to you?" Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time, he felt the weight of being pulled between the father who raised him and the wife who shaped his future. The house creaked that night, as if it too felt the tension. Richard walked the hallways in the dark, his hand brushing the walls, remembering the years he and Alina built each corner. The house had sheltered love, laughter, arguments, reconciliations. It had been a sanctuary. Now it was a battleground where whispers carried like smoke, seeping into every room. And Richard knew deep in his bones that this battle was only beginning. The house felt different in daylight, though the change was subtle. It wasn't the furniture or the colors, it was the air, the way it pressed heavier on Richard's chest when he stepped into the hallway. Perhaps it was the way Sophia moved through it, her heels clicking on the hardwood, her perfume lingering like a reminder that she now owned the atmosphere if not the deed. That afternoon, while Daniel was still at work and Lucy at school, Sophia called out to Richard. "Could you help me with something on the balcony?" Her tone was sweet, like sugar dissolved in tea. But Richard's stomach clenched the way it used to when he was a boy called to the principal's office. The balcony had always been Richard's sanctuary. On summer evenings, he and Alina would sit there, sipping tea while watching the sunset. He had built the railing himself, strong iron bars welded in place to last decades. He trusted those bars more than he trusted many people. When he stepped outside, Sophia was already there, leaning against the railing, her eyes following the street below. Her hair caught the breeze, strands flicking across her face. She turned slowly, her smile deliberate. "Look at this view," she said, spreading her arms as though presenting a prize. "Worth millions, don't you think?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "It's worth more than money." Sophia chuckled softly. "That's where you and I will never agree." She walked closer, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. "You see, Richard, you're clinging to something that's slipping anyway. Daniel and I, we're the future. Lucy is the future, and futures need foundations. Solid ones. This house could be that foundation." Richard's hands gripped the railing behind him. "You speak of foundations, but you only mean fortune. Lucy needs love, not leverage." Sophia's eyes sharpened, the sweetness peeling away. "Love doesn't keep the lights on. Love doesn't secure private schools. You want to talk about values, then value us enough to let go." Her voice rose just enough to cut through the cool breeze. She stepped closer until Richard could see his reflection in her pupils, small, tired, framed by her ambition. For a moment, silence held them both. Then, almost casually, Sophia placed her palm flat against Richard's chest. It wasn't a shove, not yet. It was a test, a whisper of what could be. "You know," she murmured, tilting her head, "from here a person could fall so easily. One slip and no one would question it. An accident." Richard's breath caught. His heart thudded against her hand, loud enough that he feared she could hear it. "You wouldn't dare," he whispered. Her smile widened. "Wouldn't I?" She pulled her hand away slowly, as if savoring the moment. Richard stepped back, his mind racing to a memory long buried. He saw Daniel at 10 years old, climbing too high in a tree, his mother shouting in fear. Richard had raced beneath the branches, arms open, ready to catch his boy if he fell. He had promised himself then that no matter what, he would always keep Daniel safe. And now here was Daniel's wife, speaking of accidents, hinting at falls, standing on the balcony of the very house Richard had built to protect his family. His throat tightened. He whispered to himself, though she was close enough to hear, "Alina, what has our son become?" Sophia straightened her dress, her smile returning to its polished veneer. "Don't look so frightened, Richard. I was only speaking in hypotheticals." She turned and walked inside, her perfume trailing after her, but her words clung heavier than any scent. Richard remained on the balcony, staring at the street below. The cars passed, the children rode their bikes, life moved on unaware of the storm brewing in one man's home. He touched the railing, feeling its cool iron under his fingertips. For the first time in decades, it no longer felt like protection. It felt like a line between life and death. That night, Richard avoided Sophia's gaze at the dinner table. Daniel chatted about work. Lucy laughed about a drawing she made, but the air was thick. Every time Sophia's eyes met Richard's, he saw the balcony in them, the threat, the danger, the unspoken promise. Lucy, innocent, handed her grandfather a folded piece of paper. "I drew us on the balcony, Grandpa. Look, me, you, and the flowers." Richard's chest ached. The paper showed bright colors, smiling faces, and the flowers Alina once planted. But to him, it was no longer a picture of joy. It was a warning of the place that had turned into a battlefield. He tucked the drawing into his pocket, kissed Lucy on the forehead, and whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart." But inside, he knew, the balcony was no longer safe. The day it happened was colder than usual, though the calendar insisted it was still early autumn. Clouds hung low, smothering the light, leaving the house dim even at noon. Richard noticed how the shadows seemed sharper, how the creaks in the wooden floors sounded like warnings. Lucy had gone to a friend's house after school. Daniel was late at the office. That left only Richard and Sophia inside the walls that were no longer a refuge. She found him in the living room, staring at the old mantel photographs. Daniel as a boy in a baseball uniform, Alina smiling with a picnic basket, baby Lucy asleep in her crib. "You live in the past," Sophia said, her voice smooth as glass. "No wonder you can't see the future." Richard didn't look at her. "The past is what gives the future meaning. Or it keeps you chained," replied. Then she smiled, tilting her head toward the balcony doors. "Come, let's get some air." He should have refused. His bones told him to stay seated, to remain in the safety of the living room, but pride or perhaps stubbornness carried him after her. He would not show fear in his own house. The balcony doors groaned open. The wind carried a faint chill, rattling the flowers in their clay pots. Richard stood a few feet away from the railing, while Sophia leaned against it, back to the street below. "You're wasting time, Richard," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Daniel and I were building something. You're standing in the way." Richard's jaw set. "I've been standing in the way of storms my whole life, but I don't let them destroy what I built." Her eyes narrowed. "Then maybe it's time the storm destroyed you." It happened faster than thought, faster than breath. Sophia moved with sudden force, her hands slamming against his chest. Richard stumbled backward, the world tilting. The railing bit into his hips. For a heartbeat, he felt nothing beneath his heels but air. His arms flailed, fingers grasping for anything solid. The horizon blurred, sky and street spinning. A single thought pierced the chaos, Alina. He imagined her voice, sharp but steady. "Hold on, Richard. Don't you dare let go." With a desperate surge, his hand found the iron bar. His knuckles scraped against the rough metal as he clung to it, his body dangling half over the drop. His chest heaved. His heart thundered like war drums. For a frozen moment, their eyes locked. Hers were wide, a mix of shock and fury, as if she hadn't expected him to catch himself. Perhaps she had imagined a clean fall, an accident beyond suspicion. Instead, she saw a man clinging to life, his face pale but unbroken, his grip iron despite the years etched into his hands. "You," Richard gasped, his voice raw. "You tried to kill me." Sophia's lips parted, then snapped shut. She stepped back, her breath uneven. You slipped. I was reaching to help." Her lie floated in the cold air, thin as paper, brittle as glass. With a groan, Richard pulled himself over the railing, collapsing onto the balcony floor. His palms were raw, his knees aching, but he was alive. He pressed his forehead against the cold stone tiles, his lungs dragging in air as though each breath was a blessing. Sophia hovered above him, her shadow long and dark. "You should be more careful," she whispered. "At your age, accidents are common." Richard pushed himself up, leaning heavily against the wall. "No accident," he rasped. "Not this time." When Daniel returned later that evening, the house was strangely quiet. Richard said little, retreating to his room, his face pale, his hands trembling when no one was looking. Sophia cooked dinner, her movements brisk, her smile rehearsed. She kissed Daniel on the cheek as if nothing had happened. But Richard knew. He had seen her eyes in that moment on the balcony. He had felt the force of her shove, the cold calculation behind her touch. The house had turned from battleground to battlefield scarred with bloodless war. And though Daniel sat at the table laughing at a story from work, Richard heard only the echo of Sophia's words. All it takes is the right storm, or the right push. Now the storm had begun. Richard did not sleep that night. His body lay on the mattress, but his mind hung over the balcony, replaying the moment when the sky opened beneath him and the ground seemed to pull him down. His palms still burned from gripping the railing. His shoulders ached from the strain of hauling himself back, and his heart, his old battered heart, throbbed with the weight of betrayal. He stared at the ceiling in the dark, whispering a name, Alina. She had once told him that love was strongest in silence, in the quiet things a person did to hold a family together. He wondered what she would say now, seeing her son bound to a woman who could smile in the kitchen and shove his father to death by afternoon. When dawn arrived, the house was calm again. Daniel hummed in the kitchen as he poured coffee, oblivious. Sophia moved gracefully around him, draping her arms over his shoulders as though she were the picture of devotion. Richard stepped in, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed. He said nothing. He sat at the table, folded his hands, and stared at them. "Rough night, Dad?" Daniel asked, unaware. Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to shout, "Your wife tried to kill me." But when he glanced at Sophia, he saw her eyes, steady, daring, full of the unspoken threat. "Say a word and who will believe you?" Richard simply nodded, didn't sleep much. Sophia's smile curved. "Perhaps you should rest more. At your age, rest is everything." Her words were honeyed poison. That afternoon, Lucy returned from school with her backpack bouncing against her small frame. She burst into the living room, her face glowing with innocence. "Grandpa, look what I drew today." She unfolded a piece of paper, a picture of her, Richard, and the balcony, colored in bright yellows and blues. Richard's chest clenched. The balcony again, always the balcony. "Beautiful," he said softly, his fingers trembling as he smoothed the page. "You make this house shine brighter than the sun, Lucy." "Can we go out there?" she asked eagerly. "Can we sit on the balcony while I tell you about my day?" Richard froze. His mind flashed back to Sophia's hands, the railing, the empty air beneath his heels. His palms broke into sweat. But Lucy's eyes were wide with expectation, her little hand reaching for his. "Of course, sweetheart," he whispered. "Let's go." They stepped onto the balcony together. The late afternoon sun washed everything in a warm glow. Lucy skipped to the railing and leaned over, giggling at the cars below. Richard's heart seized. He rushed forward, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Careful, Lucy, stay close to me." She looked up, puzzled. "Why, Grandpa, you built this strong, right? Daddy said you did." "Yes," Richard said, his voice cracking. "But even strong things need respect." He pulled her gently back and sat with her on the bench Alina had once chosen. Lucy began to chatter about her day, about spelling tests, playground games, and a new song she learned. Richard tried to listen, but his eyes kept drifting to the railing. His grip tightened around Lucy's hand. It wasn't just wood and iron anymore. It was a cliff, a reminder that safety could vanish in a single push. As Lucy spoke, Richard glanced through the glass doors. Inside, Sophia stood at the kitchen counter, her arms crossed, watching. Her eyes never left the balcony. She didn't smile this time. She simply stared as though measuring the distance, the timing, the chance she had missed. Richard turned back to Lucy and forced a smile. "Tell me more, sweetheart. I love hearing about your day." But inside he felt something stirring, not just fear but resolve. If Sophia thought he would crumble, if she thought she could shove him into silence, she had underestimated the strength that had built every brick of this house. He had one grip left, and he wasn't letting go, not of the house, not of Lucy, not of justice. That night, Richard returned to the balcony alone. He touched the railing, feeling the roughness beneath his fingers, the scars in the iron that matched the scars in his palms. He whispered again to Alina, but this time not in despair. "Your hands built this," he murmured, "and mine will hold it for Lucy, for the truth." He closed his fist around the railing, holding it with all the strength his aging body could summon. His grip was steady, his breath firm, his resolve unshakable. The storm had begun, but Richard was ready to weather it. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of old wood settling in the night. Richard sat at the kitchen table, the overhead light dim, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. His palms still bore faint scrapes from the balcony, and every time he curled his fingers, he felt the ache. It was the kind of pain that reminded him he was alive, and that someone wanted otherwise. He looked at the framed photographs on the wall, Daniel in graduation robes, Alina holding a newborn Lucy, himself on the front porch with a hammer in hand. The house had always been a stage for memories. Now it had become a stage for lies. The next afternoon, a knock echoed at the front door. When Richard opened it, he found a familiar face smiling faintly at him. "David Harris," Richard breathed, surprised. "Been years." David, now 40, carried the calm confidence of a man who spent his life inside courtrooms. He had been a close friend of Alina's cousin, and years ago, Richard had helped him move into his first apartment. They had lost touch, but the bond of old favors never truly faded. "Thought I'd check in," David said. "I was in the neighborhood, heard from an old friend that you were still here." His eyes flicked across Richard's face, reading the lines of stress. "You don't look well." Richard forced a smile. "I'm still standing." David chuckled. "Sometimes standing is half the battle." Later, in the quiet of the study, Richard spoke in low tones as if the walls themselves might betray him. "She tried to push me," he said, staring at his hands. "On the balcony, if I hadn't grabbed the railing, I wouldn't be sitting here." David's expression didn't change. He had heard confessions of every kind in his career, but his voice was firm. "Did anyone see?" Richard shook his head. "No, only her and me." "Then we need more than words," David replied. "Words against hers will crumble, but evidence doesn't lie." That evening, after David left with a promise to look into something, Richard wandered the house with new eyes. He touched the corners of rooms, glanced at the ceiling corners, the edges of the balcony. And then he remembered. 2 years ago, after a neighbor's break-in, Daniel had insisted they install small security cameras on the property. They were subtle, tucked away under the eaves, barely visible. Richard had almost forgotten them until now. His heart pounded as he pulled out the small monitor from the closet, dust covering the screen. With trembling hands, he powered it on. The screen flickered, then bloomed with grainy footage of the house exterior. He rewound the footage. Hours ticked backward, the shadows of days collapsing into minutes. And then he saw it, himself on the balcony, Sophia standing close, her sudden shove, his desperate grip, his body dangling over the edge. Richard's breath caught, his hands shook. There it was, the truth, silent but undeniable, preserved in pixels. He sat in the dark study, staring at the screen on loop. Over and over, Sophia's hands lunged, his body staggered, the railing caught him. Each replay was a dagger, yet also a shield. This was no longer just fear in his chest or whispers in his ears. This was proof. But proof alone meant nothing without timing. Richard knew Sophia. She was cunning, careful, quick to twist perception. If he revealed the footage too soon, she'd claim it was manipulated, staged, or meaningless. No, he had to wait. He had to endure. And when the moment came, when the stakes were highest, he would place this truth where no denial could survive. That night at dinner, Richard sat quietly, spooning soup but tasting nothing. Across the table, Sophia studied him. Her eyes lingered a second too long, searching for cracks. She tilted her head. "You seem better today," she said. Richard met her gaze, his face unreadable. "I suppose rest helps." Her lips curved, but her eyes narrowed. She knew something had shifted. She just couldn't yet see what, and that was his strength. For once, Richard held something she didn't. Later, as Lucy climbed onto his lap with a bedtime story, Richard kissed her forehead. Her laughter filled the room, innocent and bright. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small smile. "Grandpa, why are you smiling?" Lucy asked. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "truth finds a way to speak, even when people try to silence it." She didn't understand, but she giggled, resting her head against his chest. Richard looked beyond her to the walls, the balcony, the cameras hidden in the eaves. For the first time since Eleanor's death, he felt her hand in his, not in memory, but in resolve. The storm had not passed, but now he had lightning bottled in his hands. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and polished marble. Its walls had absorbed generations of arguments, lies, truths, and verdicts. For Richard, stepping through those doors felt both foreign and inevitable, like walking into the last chapter of a book he never wanted to write. David Harris walked beside him, briefcase in hand, his stride steady. "You don't speak unless asked," David whispered. "Let the evidence speak, that's our strength." Richard nodded. His palms were damp, his heart heavy. He had spent his life laying bricks, raising walls, protecting his family. Never had he imagined that his greatest battle would be fought not on scaffolding or rooftops, but in a courtroom against his own blood. It was Daniel who had filed the petition, a claim that his father was unfit to manage property, that the house should be transferred for the family's stability. Sophia sat beside him, immaculate in a cream suit, her hair pinned perfectly. She looked less like a daughter-in-law and more like a strategist, calm and poised. Across the aisle, Richard sat quietly. To the world, he was just an aging man clinging to the past, but in his pocket was a flash drive. On it, the balcony, the shove, the truth. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and sharp glasses, called the room to order. Daniel's lawyer began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "Your Honor, this case is about responsibility. My client seeks to ensure his father's legacy is preserved responsibly. Mr. Richard Cole is 72 years old." 62, Richard muttered under his breath. The lawyer corrected himself without pause. 62, but showing signs of diminished capacity. "We believe transferring the deed ensures stability for the younger generation." Sophia folded her hands neatly, her eyes flicking toward Richard like a predator watching prey. When it was David's turn, he stood tall, his voice calm but edged with fire. "Your Honor, this is not a case of diminished capacity. This is a case of coercion, of attempted exploitation, and we intend to prove it." The courtroom murmured. Sophia's lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Richard kept his eyes on the table. His heart pounded, but he trusted David's words more than his own. When David announced, "We have video evidence," the room stilled. He handed the flash drive to the bailiff, who loaded it onto the courtroom screen. Richard's stomach turned as the footage began. The balcony, the breeze, Sophia's hand pressing against his chest, his body lurching backward, his desperate grip on the railing. The video paused on the image of him dangling, the horizon tilted, Sophia's eyes wide. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even the judge leaned forward, her brows knit tight. "Your Honor," David said, his voice calm but resonant, "this is not the action of a man too old to manage property. This is the action of a woman attempting to silence him permanently." Daniel shot up from his chair. That's not what it looks like." His voice cracked, desperation breaking through the polish. Sophia grabbed his wrist, pulling him back down. Her face was pale, but her lips moved quickly, whispering, coaching. The judge raised her hand. "Enough. The footage speaks louder than arguments." She turned toward Sophia. "Do you deny this is you, Mrs. Cole?" For the first time, Sophia faltered. Her polished mask slipped just enough for Richard to see the fury beneath. He stumbled. I reached to steady him. The judge's gavel struck once. "Do not insult this court with half-truths." Daniel slumped in his chair, his eyes darting between the screen and his father. For the first time in years, Richard saw something crack in his son's expression. Not arrogance, not ambition, but shame. Richard's heart twisted. He had not come here to destroy his son. He had come to save himself, to save the home, to save what was left of family. But as he watched Daniel crumble under Sophia's grip, he wondered if anything of the boy he raised could be salvaged. The judge's verdict came swift and sharp. "The petition is denied. Furthermore, given this evidence, I am recommending an investigation into potential criminal assault charges against Mrs. Cole." The gavel struck again. The sound reverberated through Richard's bones like thunder rolling across open plains. Sophia's face hardened, her jaw tight. Daniel stared at the floor, unable to meet his father's eyes. And Richard exhaled. For the first time since Eleanor's death, the air in his lungs felt clean. As the courtroom emptied, David placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "Quiet justice," he said softly. Richard nodded, his gaze drifting toward the window where sunlight streamed in. Justice, yes, but also sorrow, for victories in families always came laced with wounds. Still, he walked out of the courthouse taller, steadier. Not because he had won property, but because he had refused to be erased. The house felt different when Richard returned from court. Not because the walls had changed or the furniture had been moved, but because the air itself seemed lighter. The storm had broken. The silence that once pressed against him now felt like peace. Daniel and Sophia did not come home that night. Whether they were with lawyers or hiding from shame, Richard didn't know. He only knew the house was his again, not by law alone, but by truth. Lucy was waiting on the porch when he stepped out of the cab. She ran into his arms, her laughter ringing like a bell. "Grandpa, you're home," she shouted. Richard held her tight, closing his eyes. The weight of years, of battles, of betrayal melted for a moment. In her embrace, he felt what mattered, not the deed, not the bricks, but the bond that would outlive both. That evening, Richard sat at the old oak desk in the study. David Harris had joined him, the glow of a desk lamp pooling over scattered papers. "I don't want this house to become another fight," Richard said, his voice calm. "Not after I'm gone." David nodded. "Then put it in a trust. Name Lucy as the future beneficiary. That way no one, not Daniel, not Sophia, not anyone can claim it for themselves." Richard leaned back, his hands folded. For the first time in months he felt certainty. This house was built with Alina's hands beside mine. If it belongs to anyone, it belongs to Lucy, the one person who still sees love in these walls. David drafted the documents, his pen scratching quietly. Richard signed them with a steady hand. The ink dried like a promise. Later, Richard and Lucy sat together on the balcony. The same balcony where betrayal had nearly ended his life now became the place where he reclaimed it. Lucy held her drawing again, the one of them smiling under the sun. She pressed it into his hands. "I want you to keep it forever, Grandpa." Richard smiled, his eyes misting. "And I want you to remember something, Lucy. A house isn't just wood and stone. It's the love that fills it. People may try to take what isn't theirs, but love is untouchable." She leaned against him, her small hand finding his larger one. His grip tightened, gentle but firm. The same grip that had held him over the railing, the same grip that refused to let go of life, of truth, of family. That night, Richard stood alone in the living room. He gazed at Alina's picture on the mantel, her smile eternal in the frame. "I kept it safe, Ellie," he whispered. "I kept our home for her, for Lucy, for us." The house creaked softly as if answering him. He closed his eyes, letting the sound settle into his bones. The war was over. The home was preserved. And though scars would remain, love had the final word. Thank you, dear viewers, for staying with Family Shadows through this story. We tell these tales not just for drama, but for the lessons hidden inside them. That family is more than property, that betrayal carries a price, and that quiet justice always finds a way. I wish you health, peace, and the strength to hold close the people who matter most. Until we meet again, may your homes be filled with love, and your families with happiness.